Hey there, it's Melissa with the Rogue Frontier. Today we're going to talk about a really cool subject, my family. I'm just a crazy woman with an audacious dream of having her own cattle company. And I wanted to know that there might be some possible lineage in my family that would allow me more legitimacy to having that cattle company. And you know what? I actually found out some great things and I was surprised by what I found. And I'm going to share them with you. So buckle up. It's going to be a wild ride. We're going to open the story with Uncle Roy. Uncle Roy was from Hays, Kansas, where his dad was a sod farmer. And in those days, the prairie grasses were still very prevalent. Fortunately and unfortunately, prairie grasses had such deep root systems for anybody to grow anything. In this part of the world, they had to burn off the grasses. So on one particular afternoon, Uncle Roy was stationed out on the corner of the property with a few wet gunny sacks and told that when the fire came to him, he was to put it out as promptly as possible. So Uncle Roy went out to his designated location and he stood there and waited for the fire to come his way. And come it did. And due to unforeseen circumstances, aka the winds of the prairies, by the time the fire got to Uncle Roy, it was fairly high and the winds were bringing it at a breakneck speed. And Uncle Roy attempted to try to put something out or at least wetten the ground in front of him. Uncle Roy made a calculated decision. He chose his life over saving the fire from spreading across into the neighbor's yard. He gave up. He gave up. When this wall of fire came at him, he ran. And eventually the fire put itself out, but that's not what's so important about this story. What's important is that Uncle Roy knew he was in trouble. He took the long way home that night. When he got home, he was upbraided roundly by his father, who was ashamed of him and angry and said all the terrible things that you say to your teenage son. And then Uncle Roy made a second calculated decision. He decided during the night to pick up, pack up, and get the hell out of Kansas. And he did just that. He took the few things that he had, the few dollars that he had, and snuck out to the barn, took his best horse and a mule, and headed down the road towards the west. In Uncle Roy's mind, he was going to Montana, where the opportunities were greater and there was no father to scream at him anymore. And so he did. He headed west. Unfortunately, I think Uncle Roy did not understand the distance that he had to travel and the time required to arrive there. And so after several weeks on the road, a very tired, a very worn out, and semi-starved young man was struggling towards his destination of Montana. He was in Wyoming at this point, so he'd come roughly 700 miles on his own. And then there was that one fateful day when, as he was still wandering slowly across this Great Plains of Wyoming through the sagebrush, he saw in the distance some dust arising and stretching out across the horizon. And he knew what that was because he had seen that same thing in the distance several times. But this time it was going to be different. What he saw on the plains of Wyoming was a herd of Mustangs. And he was, at this point, so desperate that he was going to go get some of those Mustangs. So he went down into one of the draws, which are infamous areas where the water rushes through, down sub-level on the plains of Wyoming. He set up a quick corral with his mule at one end and ropes tied to some of the brambles and branches and little shrub trees down there in the draw. And then he headed out as fast as possible to cut off that wild herd of Mustangs and corral it back towards the draw. And he got there and he started to push the herd back towards his corral. And as he did, he was able to get more and more of them going in the same direction. If you can imagine coming head on with a single horse, a herd of galloping Mustangs, I cannot believe that this kid had the balls to do what he did. But he did. He pushed those Mustangs back towards his corral in the draw, and slowly as he got them towards the corral, more and more of them broke off in a crazed fit of not understanding why the lead stallion was no longer leading him in the same direction. So there was mayhem and chaos, and Uncle Roy was involved in all of this mayhem. But as luck would have it, he was able to get at least a couple of the stallions and a couple of the mares pushed into the corral. And by the time he got there, he was down to one mare and one stallion, and he got them into this draw, and he started to work them and realized that he could only rope one at a time, and he decided to go for the stallion, another calculated decision. And as he did, he was able to head the stallion, and he lost the mare. He had the stallion, he pulled on the stallion, and what ensued was a struggle between horse and man, back and forth, back and forth. He was able to finally tie off the stallion to this little shrub that was weak, but the stallion was weaker. And once he had him tied, he was able to hobble him to the bush. And Uncle Roy took a breath. Several hours in, he was exhausted. He was thirsty. Everybody was thirsty. The horses were thirsty. The mule and he, all thirsty. But he took a breath. He relaxed. He rested. He took a little snooze down there in the draw. And then he woke up and unhobbled the horse and started trying to tame it once again. And this same process of untying, wrestling with the stallion, and then tying up and hobbling the stallion would happen over several days. He struggled and struggled, and what he was hoping would be relatively easy was not, not at all. But then after snoozing for a little bit and waking up once more, he had a brilliant idea. And this was it. He decided, another calculated decision, to tie the stallion to the mule and let him go. And let him run as far as they could, as fast as they could, until they were tired out. And he thought that that probably would be what would settle the stallion. What would tame the stallion was to be tethered to the mule. And so he did it. He tethered the stallion to the mule and he let him go. Let him rip across the sage of Wyoming and towards the unknown. Just whatever direction they went in was the direction he was going to follow on the horse. The mule was in charge, and that stallion knew it. And eventually, following close behind, Uncle Roy was able to get that stallion and the mule once again tethered to his horse, tied up like a small mule train, and he knew then that he was in good. So instead of continuing on to Montana, as he had planned to do, he headed south towards Cheyenne, another 300 miles. Now, he had barely anything left by the time he got to Cheyenne. But when he did arrive there, he was able to sell that stallion for a pretty penny, $40, which was a lot of money in those days. And with that $40, he sold his mule too and traded it in for another one, stayed in Cheyenne for a few days, stocking up, and then he headed back north towards this area around Gillette where he had found that stallion. It was for the course of the next few years that Uncle Roy continued this strategy of capturing and taming wild Mustangs. What a great story, huh? What a great dude. And yet it wasn't over. So Uncle Roy, realizing that he needed to find a way, a little more stable way of surviving, ended up getting involved with the U.S. Army. And he became a thoroughbred breeder. They brought him some Kentucky thoroughbreds. He didn't have to train these guys, which was ideal for him. He just had to breed them and wait 5 years, and then he handed him over to the U.S. Army. And Uncle Roy was able to get his land holdings to a deeded homestead of 160 acres. But 160 acres in Wyoming is nothing. You cannot sustain animals on just that property. So Uncle Roy began to negotiate and work through business dealings, and he was able to expand his land holdings. And yet it still wasn't enough. And his operation was being hampered by what he had in the way of feed. And so Uncle Roy, being as clever as he was, still under the age of 20, decided to reach out to his family and look for investors. And he was able, through all of his inner workings of the family across the United States, from West Virginia to Wyoming, he was able to acquire enough money from his family to buy up to 10,000 acres in Wyoming. Some of it was deeded property and some of it was acquisition, but that property was enough to sustain an actual operation of ranching. And so it was that Uncle Roy thought, well, it's time to get into ranching. And so he reached out to that same investor group, and he was able to convince one of his cousins to join him out in Wyoming. His name was Sidney. Sidney was my grandfather, and my grandfather was a really clever man, just like Uncle Roy. At a very young age, he had left West Virginia, where his family farm was, and headed out to Nebraska and onward into Wyoming. And he ran the Chisholm Trail. He was pushing cattle out from Texas and following the grasses north to Montana. But Sidney did this for several seasons and realized that he had a knack for it, but he didn't want to keep just day working as a cowboy. It was exhausting and hard work and lonely. And so it was that Sidney, wanting to settle down, found a rather attractive young lady and propositioned her, and she accepted his proposition, and they eloped to Cheyenne, Wyoming. And that was Sidney, my grandfather, and Gigi, my grandmother. And then they headed up to Uncle Roy's property in Gillette, Wyoming, where they showed up and said, "Put us to work, Roy." Now, Roy had, up to that point, been married and had children, but his wife unfortunately passed away and his children wandered off, and so he was alone. He had his land and he had his breeding operation, but he really couldn't do more than that without help. My grandfather, Sidney, and Gigi stepped up to the plate. And so Sidney set to work. He was good at livestock and animal husbandry, and he understood how to graze the lands, to preserve and grow the lands over time, to feed as many animals and be as fertile as possible. He also built all the buildings. He built the Cow Creek Ranch buildings. He ended up, during the Depression, actually hiring himself out to build additional buildings throughout Gillette, one of which still stands to this day, right on I-90. And this picture I took during my research. And I will just tell you at this stage that it was a very moving experience for me to find and stand in front of a barn that my grandfather had built almost 150 years ago. Yes, it's in downtown Gillette. It's right across from the McDonald's on I-90. And yeah, it was a moment that I'm very proud of. So grandfather Sidney and Lorraine stayed on the ranch for 12 years. And he took over from my Uncle Roy during the time when Uncle Roy went to war. During the war, the breeding operation, the demand by the U.S. Army for thoroughbreds drew to a quick close. As you know, if you've seen the movie War Horse, there was no competition when it came to modern machinery versus horse, and not something I ever want to get into. So Sidney looked towards expanding his operations in ranching. And yes, he did quite well. He grew the herd of cattle to 200 pairs on that 10,000 acres and 500 sheep. it was by no means a small operation at that time in Wyoming. And he was well respected for what he did, because not only was he managing cattle and sheep, my grandfather Sidney had a knack for machinery. And so he introduced machinery into that operation to help increase efficiency and profitability of his ranch. And that was such a great thing for me to learn, because as a technologist, I'm heartened to know that, that too comes from my bloodlines. So it was a great run. For 12 years, my grandfather Sidney and my Gigi stayed on the ranch. They had a son there. And so it was working very, very well when Uncle Roy came back from the war. And that, unfortunately, was a turn of events that nobody was expecting. You see, Uncle Roy thought that they could resume things the way that they were when he came back from the war, and that he was the boss, and that Sidney was just going to step in line. But of course, time changes, and Sidney had become very confident in his ability to run that ranch without Uncle Roy. And so when Uncle Roy showed up, it wasn't great, and they had a falling out, and they had to settle. Uncle Roy bought my grandfather Sidney out of the property. I'm certain that he didn't make that much money on it, but it was basically tied up in the 10,000 acres that was owned by this investment group. And grandfather Sidney sold all the equipment because Uncle Roy didn't want the equipment. He didn't know how to use it. It wasn't of interest to him. But one thing that Uncle Roy wanted, which he was allowed to have at least for a while, was my uncle George, my Sidney and Gigi's son, which I find to be just such a crazy thing. Uncle Roy wanted George to continue on the ranch to help him run his operation because he had nobody else. And so they agreed, at least for a while, that George was going to stay on the ranch. Grandfather Sidney and Gigi packed up and they moved to Sheridan, which wasn't too far away, but it was at a distance far enough away that George couldn't live with his parents. He had to stay there with Uncle Roy. And so he visited his parents in Sheridan from time to time. But Uncle Roy and George continued to run the ranch without much success. And so I will just finalize the Uncle Roy part of the story by saying, as much as he tried, he was not able to make the ranch a success without his thoroughbred breeding, because he didn't know that much about livestock, and he had lost the best thing on the ranch, which was actually grandfather Sidney. It was not long after, maybe a year or two, that Uncle Roy sold out of his property. He sold the property in its entirety, and he moved to Gillette and started his own business there, entirely exiting the ranching business. And so the Cow Creek Ranch is still there in its entirety, and it's only been sold twice, but it's been sold, and it's no longer a part of my family. I want to tell you that you should go buy a hat from the Roe Cattle Company, because all the proceeds for the sale of these hats goes to help me support my efforts to start my cattle company in Three Forks, Montana. So go buy hats. Thank you. God bless you. And so we move on to Sheridan. They moved from Gillette to Sheridan. They moved around town a little bit. Grandfather Sidney struggled to find regular work. He did some mechanicking. He did some day cowboying and so forth, continuing to promise all this time to Gigi that he would, in fact, be able to get his own ranch again here in Sheridan. And Gigi believed him. Gigi held out. Everybody does. Everybody wants to live the dream of the Wild West, to be a cowboy, to be a rancher, to have your own stock. Everybody The mine at Acme had a job that opened up. Sydney and Gigi moved into Acme, Wyoming. Acme is a town that no longer exists because it was a mine town, and they picked up when the mine closed and moved every bit of equipment, houses, and foundations to the city of Sheridan. It was good money, even though the mine itself was sort of on its way out. It was on the waning years of the mine's operation. Sydney and Gigi moved into a tiny, tiny little house. And then they made the call to Uncle Roy that George had to come home. And they expanded their family there. They had these 3 girls, the 6 of them squeezed into that little bungalow and lived there for the next several years. All the while, I believe that Sydney continued to promise to Gigi that they would have that ranch. And as a result, what he did to make his wife happy, he filled the home. He filled the home with beautiful furniture, probably more than he should have spent on, and a new car, a car that would allow her to go to and from Sheridan, and she learned to drive it. And so it was the state of things when tragedy struck. My grandfather, Sidney, had gone down in the mine that day, like any other day, to work, to fix the machines down in the mine. And unfortunately, on that given day, one of the machines broke loose from its tether. It was being brought down into the mine, and the cable snapped, and the machine swung free, and it was swinging towards a miner. And according to legend and lore, my grandfather Sidney pushed that man out of the way, and the machine hit up against him and dropped directly onto his foot, smashing it completely. They were able to get the heavy equipment off of my grandfather Sidney, and he was rushed to the hospital in Sheridan. But the prognosis was pretty clear that, yes, grandfather Sidney would survive, but his foot was a mess. So badly so that he knew that he would never go back down in the mine. So did the mine company. And they were grateful to him for saving the life of the other miner. And so they added just a little bit more to the severance that they gave him. The severance that was to pay off my grandfather, Sidney and Gigi, came with some strings attached. They would lose their home. They would lose their home, and my grandfather would lose his job. Reality sunk in pretty quickly that this family that had spent now almost 20 years in Wyoming was going to have to leave with nothing. They sold all their furniture at a loss. They sold their brand new car at a loss. They packed their belongings into a train, and their 4 children headed back across the United States to a place that only Sidney knew, Point Pleasant, West Virginia. Needless to say, Gigi was devastated. This place, this alien place that was humid in the summer beyond belief, far away from everything that she had ever known and all the people that she had known and loved. She had to leave Wyoming. Grandfather Sidney told her over and over again that they would go back to Wyoming. 2 years, he promised her, just 2 years, just until I can save up enough money to get back there and we can buy that ranch that we have been planning on. 2 years. Well, they moved in with his parents. And 2 years, it was too long. 2 years living under the roof of people that she hardly knew, probably never met, with 4 kids in tow. And soon thereafter, they were out of there. They bought their own small property across the river in Ohio, and they began their new life. My Gigi resigned herself to this new place, this place that was devastatingly hot and humid in the summertime, with all kinds of bugs and creepy crawlies and things that would kill you, on a property that she didn't want. But she was a pioneer woman, and she made the best of it. And my grandfather, Sidney, wasn't able to make enough money to support the family on just farming alone. So he went to work in a manufacturing facility across the river. He opened up a small garage in Rutland, Ohio. And unfortunately, this new reality, this new life that he lived, his physical inabilities took their toll on my grandfather, and he began to drink. And as my aunts would say, he drank more than they wanted him to. He drank and drank. And while he was still a very kind man, he had lost his spirit, and in doing so became embittered. My grandfather, Sidney, died at a relatively young age, essentially of alcoholism. A broken man, broken body, broken spirit. He knew that he had not given his family what he'd promised. And yet there was one thing that he did. He transferred his love of the American West, of ranching, of being a cowboy, to his children. He told them stories that would stick till this day. Every single one of them can recount stories of their lives living in Wyoming. These stories took deep root in one particular child, their middle child, Mary. Mary was a special child. She was relatively simple, and she wore these thick Coke bottle glasses because her vision was very poor. She was the runt of the family, very short compared to her siblings. But there was something about Mary. She was born in Acme, Wyoming, but she grew up in southeastern Ohio, in Appalachia. And she developed that Appalachian accent and that bit of that southern twang. And she made it her ambition to somehow return there to Wyoming and be a cowgirl and marry a cowboy. So with a girl with a vivid imagination, grew up, and she headed off to business college at the ripe age of 17, moving to Columbus to live with her older sister and to learn to be a secretary. She had just started business school, and one weekend, she and her sister's husband-to-be all got into his car and headed towards the family farm. They were hit almost head-on by a drunk driver. He hit the side of the car where my mother was, and my mother was thrown into the metal dashboard and under the dashboard where her body was crushed. Most of the damage was done to my mother. Her sister did in fact break some vertebrae in her neck, and her husband-to-be was fine. But Mary would spend the next 2 years in and out of the hospital. She would have to return to the family farm, and she had to quit business school. And most of that time she spent in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting to heal. And she knew at that moment that she would not be becoming the cowgirl in the West, that she would not be able to ever ride horses again, that her reality had changed considerably. And I think this is the part of the story that is the most inexplicable. And yet it's beautiful. And I'll tell you why. Because my mother was not going to give up. Her story had changed. Her dreams had changed. But her life was at risk. Her well-being was at risk. And she was not going to live her life on her back. She was not going to be an invalid. She was not going to be a burden on her family. And so while she laid there in that bed, she prayed to God. She prayed for rescue and absolution. And she prayed until one day when her broken body fused the bones that were broken in her legs. Her body fused, and she knew it. She knew it. She got up and she walked into the kitchen and she told her mother, who was there, that she'd had a healing, that her body was healed. And when her bones fused, the metal pieces that had been attached to her bones, holding them together, broke loose. This is the most incredible part of this story. The pieces that were attached to my mother's hip and leg bones were broke loose because they were no longer needed. My mother found God. So yes, she wasn't a cowgirl. And she didn't know if she'd ever go back to Wyoming, but she knew that her life was changed for good. And she accepted that and she submitted. And she loved God her whole life. She became a healer. And I am witness to some of the most amazing miracles of that amazing woman. I am so grateful that she was my mother. After she had her healing, she returned to business school and finished business school. And shortly thereafter, she met my father. She had become a beautiful woman, and she remained a beautiful woman till the day she died. It was almost like that accident turned this awkward, young, spirited girl into a stunning daughter of God. He asked my mom to marry him in November, and she accepted his proposal with one condition: that she could have surgery to have those parts of metal removed from her leg before she got married. And that the doctor would confirm with her that she could have children. And so she did. She had the surgery before they got married and had those bits of metal that had nothing but they were just hanging out in her leg. I know that sounds so crazy, but it's true. She had this. My mother was a walking miracle. She married my father, an engineer. And instead of going to Wyoming as she had originally planned, she ended up going to California. And that was okay with her. That was okay with her. It was still an adventure. And she never lost her connection to Wyoming. She loved country music. She dreamed of her cowboy, still secretly. And she continued being a country girl until the day she died. And there you have it. The three broken branches of my family tree: Uncle Roy, Sydney, and my mother. All three making attempts to make it in the American West. All embodied the spirit of the pioneer, the risk taker, the outlaw, the rogue. Yes, they were all rogues in their own way. So, there you have it. My family tree. My crazy family. The legacy of my rogue cattle company. And I know that most of you look at these members of my family and see only failure and loss, tragedy, and broken dreams. All of those things are part of what makes the American West what it is. And so you have to embrace the failures and the risks. I do. I'm an entrepreneur. I have embraced risk my entire career. But I just want to say, in closing, look at Uncle Roy. Yes, he ended up selling the ranch, but what a run. He, at 16, was out taming Mustangs, capturing Mustangs on the wild frontier, going into breeding thoroughbreds for the U.S. Army, then expanding his operations from 160 acres that the government deeded him to 10,000 acres of land in Wyoming. And then this land is preserved. It will never be subdivided. That was part of his plan from the very start. Despite buying that property, he believed that at some point in the future, that land might be given back to the Native Americans. It was hunting ground for them. And that is possible with 10,000 acres. That's a man with vision. And God bless Uncle Roy. And what about my grandfather, Sydney? Sydney was an engineer. He was an operations guy. He was a man after my own heart. Not only did he want to do livestock like I do, and did, he was absolutely successful at his business ventures in livestock. But he also introduced new technology. He embraced change, and he was willing to try new things that a lot of ranchers wouldn't necessarily do. And then, of course, there's my mom, my mother, who embodied the feminine archetype. She had love, and she just had this incredible spirit. And it was truly the spirit of the frontier. Did she ever get to experience that in her own life? No. But she carried it onward into me. That was her purpose. And she brought me God. I couldn't have asked for more from anyone in my life. So, thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of The Rogue Frontier. I hope you I hope you share, subscribe, and I look forward to seeing you the next time on The Rogue Frontier.